your actual capabilities in the present. Uh, what's your actual? And I think right there, that would be helpful for this person to be appreciative, kind of an appreciative inquiry, to use that phrase that's well known now, an appreciative inquiry of your own actual, distinct from potential, right? And I have a hunch that in this person's actual is a fair amount of emotional history in which they maybe fell short or were criticized for not, getting an A again. And they've built up kind of an emotional memory bank of negative experiences of trying and not quite succeeding. There are many people, I grew up in that way myself. My parents, my mom in particular, had really high performance expectations. And so if I did well in school, she would say, oh, I expected that. If I did, I missed one question in 20 on a math homework, she'd say, why'd you miss that one question, Rick? So there was only a downside, related to any awareness of how I was actually performing. So maybe there's something like that. So that's what I would be wondering for starters. What's in the present? What's in the actual? Let's come into the present. Let's explore the present, because clearly this preoccupation with the future, which by the way is very self-saturated, there's also a lot of selfing in here, comparison to others, wanting to appease the inner audience, to propitiate the angry gods inside by impressing them or proving oneself again and again. Well, that's very self-referential too. Okay, those are two thoughts off the top. How about you? What's your take on this?
Sometimes for the mailbag, I shorten down the questions a little bit just for the sake of time and clarity. And maybe this is because I got kind of more the full picture that was in the longer form question. But what really stood out to me in it was what I'll call gifted kid syndrome. This is something that I've had to struggle with a lot in my life, and I've talked to a lot of friends roughly my age, kind of millennials or younger millennials, who were labeled bright, talented, or gifted early on in life. And they were really sold the sun and the moon and the stars by how people kind of talked to them about what was going to happen. Everybody was going to grow up to be an astronaut and change the world, right?
That's right.
And now they feel kind of paralyzed by this perception of a gap between that perceived potential that was really emphasized throughout their entire academic experience. And then they pop out into the real world, and there is this brutal realization that A, there are an awful lot of smart people on the planet, and B, no one really cares anymore. And I mean that kind of in a general way, that just normal people moving through the world are not as invested in your personal development as your parents were. Yeah. The company that you work for is not as invested in like getting the most out of you and really, really recognizing the bright spark that lies within us all as maybe your parents were or your teachers were or whatever it is. And I just think we really did a lot of people dirty through how we talked to them about this, which obviously came from a really good place. It really came from this place of wanting to build people up and tell them how, what a special snowflake they were and all of that. So anyways, that's kind of like context on how I think about this. And when you are really closely identified with your potential, trying is a risk. Kind of like you were talking about, Dad, like coming into the present is a risk, because you can only be disappointed if you try. If you never really try, you can always tell yourself the story that you could have succeeded if you had just tried. There's no identity threat there. So you can have an identity of being a gifted person who also is just kind of a little bit lazy. Like that was my identity for a long time. And there was something in the laziness that was protective of the gifted kid identity. I couldn't like disprove it.
Oh yeah, the protection, like in my example, of fear of criticism, basically. And
totally, yeah.
By standing out, I would become vulnerable then to a shaming attack of some kind.
Absolutely. And so I'm wondering how you've seen people kind of work with that or move through that.
I think of kind of like a mid-level intervention and then a deep intervention. So mid-level intervention would be to help yourself, to resource yourself so you're more willing to risk the dreaded experience, as we talk about, in very, very careful graduated steps. So let's suppose here's a person who wants to avoid risking the dreaded experience of disappointment or the dreaded experience of being criticized by other people or dreaded experiences of going into situations where he's with other capable people and he's no longer a star on the team. Right. So then what a person would do is think, okay, what inner psychological strengths would help me deal with those experiences of disappointment or social comparison or being criticized? So how can I grow those experiences in a step-by-step way? This is a quick summary of our book, Resilient. And then on the basis of growing them, how can I take small risks that go well, usually, and when they go well, I can internalize the results and gradually push back the bars of my invisible cage. Okay, that's a bit of a shtick people who listen to the show may have heard before, but it's really, really good advice. And it's just what I'd call a middle level intervention. Now, the deeper level intervention.
That's pretty good middle level intervention, Dad. You're coming in with some gas. Go ahead.
Okay. I always like it when the youngins appreciate when the old guys are coming in
the ancient wisdom
coming in
of
hot.
The previous generation, right? You know, God, not to opine about this. Maybe we should do a whole episode about this sometimes. I guess I'm just a little loose today or something. But like all of that, this is going to get, oh my God, I can't believe I'm talking about this.
Go for it.
Into so much trouble. You know that. I don't even know if I'm talking about this.
Do
Okay,
it.
all right. You know, like all those online programs or whatever that like the phrase ancient wisdom is
Yeah, I've
used
used it myself.
I think you've used it yourself, even talking about Buddhist practice.
Hey,
Yeah,
I coined it. I coined it.
Oh, you really did. God, I'm talking to the source of the problem
Come on,
right now.
okay. All right.
Man, the phrase ancient wisdom just kind of gets me. I don't know why. But just in general, I think it's kind of overused and corny and whatever. But it's funny to think of the idea of like the ancient wisdom is actually the boomers. You know, it's your generation, Dad.
Oh.
You're the ancient wisdom to me. We don't have to go 2,000 years into the time bank for this one.
That's what I'm talking about.
I could just look down the street. Yeah, totally.
Yeah, I'm talking about ancestral lineages. I'm talking about great
totally.
teachers. Okay, thanks for sharing. Yeah, but that's right. Ancient wisdom.
I didn't mean to just like complain and opine for a minute, but you know.
No, my 72-year-old dad, ancient. Fuck you.
It's all right. You got a lot of tread left on your tires, Dad. Don't worry. You'll be pushing that rock up the hill a little longer.
Well, we hope so. But honestly, you know, there's a lot of value in living in a way that you're ready for the lights to go out.
Wow. Way to just like hit me with that one. I'm gonna go to bed at night just staring at the ceiling. Yeah, that's some ancient wisdom right there. All right. Okay, Dad. Deep level. Sorry, I just totally derailed us. I couldn't help myself.
Okay, good. Well, I'm really I think in a way a deeper intervention is to get out of the frame of the future. This person's really in the frame of the future. I'm hearing a lot of ruminating about the future, and that's very much the nature of the brain, especially in the default mode network, the ruminator, doing mental time travel. We're imagining different futures, and that's what a lot this person is doing, which have the function of moving away from the present, derailing useful action, and avoiding various dreaded experiences bubbling away under the surface. I would invite this person to come into not the potential, but the actual of your own abilities, your own capacities, and the actual of where your passions really lie. Again, words. I was very struck by the oddball word when this person named fear, apathy, and resistance. And for me, the oddball in those three words, the one that stood out next to the two, was apathy. I get fear and resistance. That's very functional, right? Resisting dreaded experience. Apathy. That's a really interesting word. Now, sometimes apathy has a defensive purpose because it helps us avoid risks of dreaded experiences. But very often it's present because we just really don't care. And so I'm immediately wondering about the so-called idealized future self. Maybe the person's apathetic because they're living out the agendas of other people that they've internalized, or the various shoulds of the shiny, super duper treasure island kind of life they're supposed to have that they actually don't care much about. What do you actually care about in the present? In other words, what's the actual of what it's like to be you and your actual capabilities and your actual passions? And if you find the actual passions, then you're not apathetic and you don't care so much about the results. You get much more focused on process, intrinsic goals, which I think were kind of implicit in what you were saying, and you might have more about that. But if you really care about it, if you love doing X, it'd be nice to be super successful at X, but it's less important. The less you care about doing X, the more important extrinsic rewards are, like status and fame and fortune and money. So find what you really care about in the actual of who you deeply are.
That's a really great point, Dad. I gotta give the ancient
For an
wisdom
old
some
guy.
credit for an old guy. That's that's a really good point for an old guy. I'm really excited to wear this joke out by the end of the episode. But no, I think it's truly a great point. And what you were saying a second ago about the kind of everydayness of it, the process focus,
Yeah.
I think is a huge piece of this. So one really good version of process focus is, do I like what I'm doing? And that's what you're bringing to here. Like the more that you enjoy what you're doing, the less it becomes about doing it for the sake of fill in the blank. And it becomes less about that and more about the joy of the process itself. And there's probably my favorite line from that I've ever heard related to Buddhist practice is before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. I think it's a beautiful line. And there's something in the chop wood, carry water of it all that has really started to speak to me. Maybe it's because I too am becoming an old man. And in my 37-year-old dotage, I've started to kind of enjoy the everyday acts of things, or like find more pleasure in these little moments of engagement, feeling more of like being in the present with what it is that I'm doing. And that's a kind of natural antidote to the moving into the future that, to your point, is like all over this question, right? There's so much preoccupation with the future. And okay, how can we kind of bring you more and more into what's happening right now? Find a little bit more enjoyment in that, even in the mundanity of it, even in the boring everyday. So you're a little bit less preoccupied with this sense of needing to build the pyramids in order to be a successful person in life.
Fantastic.
Awesome. Great question. Love these questions. Next question. I've been living abroad for 10 years, and I've learned the local language. Though I've made good progress, I still feel very shy about speaking. My perfectionism and self-criticism kicks in. I notice my mistakes, and sometimes I just freeze. In a few months, I will start a psychotherapy course that will require speaking this language at a high level daily, and I'm terrified. Do you have any tips on overcoming this performance anxiety?
Well, I can relate. As you know, I lived in Finland for my junior year in high school and went to a Swedish language boys' school because a certain edge of Finland near Sweden, many people there speak Swedish as their native tongue. So I actually got fairly good at Swedish, but I was very shy about speaking it. Performance anxiety is a huge topic. There's a lot about it. There's the factors underneath it all, like imposter syndrome, perfectionism, self-referentiality. We tend to watch ourselves and then we tend to perform, not so well. So what do you do about that, right? And, obviously practice helps. Reframing the purpose. What's your purpose there? Is it to connect with others? Is it to be generous and large-hearted? Is it to find the good in them? My one suggestion would be to shift your focus away from yourself in your classes into how can I see good in others, even if they speak the language fluently because it's their native tongue. They too are grappling with feelings of inadequacy, their own concerns about performance. How can I be supportive of them? How can I be a kind person who maybe garbles a word or two every so often and has an accent? Right? How can I be over there? That will tend to move you out of yourself, and it'll actually help your speaking to become more, fluent and fluid. I like the phrase, play a game you can win at. So sometimes we're in situations where, we cannot succeed in terms of the obvious goals, but we can redefine the game into something we can win at. So tennis, like I would be a poor tennis player, say, and I'd be playing someone who was patient with me and much better. I would be interested, can I get 1 point? I'll never win a game, let alone a set, but can I win a point? Or I'm never going to win a point, but can I improve my backhand? Can I learn something along the way, including it's a shift into process goals, distinct from outcome goals. So with regard to being in an environment in which you're nervous about speaking in a language that's not native to you, how would you redefine the game, as it were? How do you redefine your goals into ones you can actually succeed at? That's an example broadly. That's the broad principle in which my example of focusing on being large-hearted, caring, and supportive of others would be useful to you, because that's something you can definitely succeed at.
That's a great point, Dad. And I think my primary advice would be the very simple functional advice that I'm sure this person has gotten. Can you do the kind of low stakes practice inside of this language that might support you in what you're trying to do? Can you, learn the vocabulary associated with this particular discipline that you want to become more proficient at, and just make sure you've kind of checked your boxes there. I also wonder about something called non-corrective practice. Most of the time when we practice, we have a running thing that's going in the back of our minds that's focused on correction. So we have a frame that we're entering into with the person that we're practicing with of mutual correction. Hey, am I doing this okay? Does this feel good to you? Did that make sense? And we sort of expect inside of that, we're both signing up for being corrected by the other person. Oh, you said this, you really should have said that. Well, that creates a certain model of conversation for a person. It creates a model of we're here to correct each other, and we're here to focus on improvement as opposed to focusing on some of the other things that we actually mentioned in the first question, focusing on enjoyment, focusing on fulfillment. What are the things you're trying to actually really get out of this? And so I wonder about that as a kind of tool that might over time help to start kind of decouple this self-evaluation that is really leading to a lot of distress for this person from the activity that they're doing. If every time that they engage this activity, or the majority of times that they engage in it, they're expecting a degree of criticism, that can already kind of get in the way of some stuff here. The other thing I would just mention is how can we change the target from speaking really well to whatever else it is that you're trying to actually get out of this thing. Can people understand you? Can you make progress in this course? Are you getting what you need to get out of this? Understanding that everyone's going to make some mistakes, kind of the common humanity of it all of those little bits and pieces. So I would wonder about all of those parts as well.
That's great, Forrest. I'm just reflecting on, is there any last thing I could offer? And there is a last thing.
Okay.
Actually,
we love
small.
a last thing.
Well, it has to do with the nature of communicating. And classic lines like, people will always forget what you say. They will never forget how you made them feel. And I'm thinking of Deborah Tannen's point about communicating, including the explicit content, second, the emotional tone, and third, a statement about the paradigm or framework in which the relationship is living, particularly related to aspects of power. And maybe a way to think about it too is that the words and your accent and your bungled grammar from time to time, that's really secondary. So much of what we communicate is in body language, emotional tone, the stance that we're in, the frame that we're in the relationship. That's what really matters. And maybe that's a lot of what there is to focus on.
And that's kind of the purpose of language, right? We're trying to communicate with other people, and a huge part of that is sharing the feeling that's associated with it. So I think that's a great point, great place to leave that question. And we can move on to our third one. I feel like I was conditioned into learned helplessness as a child, and it's easy for me to experience the freeze state. What can I do to work on this? So before we get into it, quick note, we did a whole episode on all of the stress responses, including the freeze response. The part of this question that I was really interested in, Dad, was the learned helplessness part. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that in particular.
Well, if you'd like, I could offer a very quick summary of how the original research in learned helplessness by Martin Seligman and others
proceeded. There might be something in there that people can get or learn from. I think that'd be great.
Which will enable me to make some general points.
Yeah.
Recently, Dr. Seligman has kind of restated his paradigm, but in my view, the essential matters remain. In other words, a person acquires a sense of futility, entrapment, and defeat, and then they generalize that into other situations in their life and what to do about that. So really, really briefly, and I'm going to describe research on dogs that occurred 30 or 40 years ago, long before much more stringent ethical standards. Very briefly, there was a training phase and then a testing phase. I'm simplifying and summarizing a whole line of research with many academics besides Martin Seligman. Essentially, during the training phase, dogs would be randomly assigned to the A group and the B group. They'd be brought in as pairs. So you'd have the A1, B1 dog, the A2, B2 dog, matched pairs. And they'd be brought into identical training booths that had a metal floor. They'd be brought in, the door would be closed, everything was identical, the A group and the B group. A light would start flashing, a bell would start ringing, and then some seconds later, let's say 10 seconds, there would be an unpleasant electrical shock on the metal floor of the cage. Well, the dogs had no idea what was going on. They would thrash. There was a big button in the cage, right at shoulder height for a dog. And one of the dogs would hit that button and it would turn off the electric shock in both cages. So the amount of aversive experience, the amount of so-called punishment that the dogs experienced was exactly the same. The only difference was the button did not work in the B group cage. And after several trials, the A group and the A1 dog and the B1 dog and so forth would be brought in. The bell would start ringing. The A1 dog would just bump the button and would prevent the shock before it actually occurred. At that point, the matched pair were then brought into the testing phase. So you can follow the training phase so far. In the testing phase, the notion was that, well, because they'd had this training, the B group dogs would be more helpless. As in the ways that dogs are. They wouldn't learn that quickly how to deal with the challenge. So the challenge in the training phase, probably the testing phase, was a different kind of a pen, more like a long rectangle with a barrier in the middle. And one floor was metal and the other side was not. So they would bring the dogs in and they'd put them in the metal side. The bell would start to ring. And then 10 seconds later, their side of the barrier would be electrified. The first time that happened, the A group dogs would look around and jump over the barrier to safety. After one or two of those events, they'd be brought in. The bell would start to ring. They would jump over the barrier before their side of the cage was electrified. Fine. Then when they brought the B group dogs in, the trained in helplessness dogs, first of all, they looked, as the researchers said, the dog equivalent of human depression. They were not hungry. They were not interested in sex. They looked dispirited. They were mopey. They would startle. They were traumatized. Any little thing. They just were not happy dogs. The A group dogs were just typical dogs. They'd had a stressful experience, but they beat it. They overcame it during the training phase. And so in the testing phase, they were still happy-go-lucky dogs. So now they bring the B group dogs in and they electrify their side of the testing rectangle, expecting them maybe to jump over the barrier more slowly. They didn't jump at all. They just lay there
They had
and
accepted
whimpered.
their fate. Yeah.
They just whimpered. It was really sad. And the whole psychology of what it was like for the researchers to be doing this experiment, that's a whole other conversation. The researchers thought, wow, okay, let's get rid of the barrier. No barrier, just a painted line across, the long rectangle. Bring them in, same thing. Bell rings, electricity comes. It's unpleasant, not horrible, but it's unpleasant. They just lie there and whimper. They don't like it. They don't even get up to walk across the line. The researchers were amazed. They said, okay, let's just start dragging the dogs across. So they'd walk into the room with rubber boots and rubber gloves. When the side was electrified where the B group dog was, they would haul them to safety. And they think, okay, they'll learn quickly. Dogs are smart. Nope. They had to haul them across that line many times, maybe dozens of times, maybe even more, to teach them that, actually, there was escape from a painful condition, or, you could do things to help yourself. So we see right here an example on steroids, or if you will, electrified, of the negativity bias, in which, one single or a small number of episodes of entrapment and defeat during the training phase needed to be overcome by many times as many positive experiences of efficacy, agency, and success. That's the fundamental structure. Now, in this case, to make another point, the neutral stimulus is a bell ringing or a light flashing, to which the dogs associated the expectation of pain and developed the dog equivalent of emotional reactions of trauma and fear. Okay. The problem for many humans is that in addition to developing learned helplessness about a particular situation, like your father or your mother or your older brother or some teacher in school, we very often tend to generalize learned helplessness to many more neutral stimuli and eventually life itself. Living becomes the neutral stimulus to which we've associated the response of learned helplessness. And so people then in general can be living with a low grade, if not a medium grade, freeze response in their autonomic nervous system that has actually become chronic. It's not just episodic in reaction to a particular trigger. It's, it's who I am. And because it's who I am, I don't notice it anymore. Okay, so I just wanted to lay that foundation, partly to, inform people, and then to use it as a frame in which we can talk about what can people do. So I'm pausing for...
Oh, sorry, Dad. Did you want to keep on going with what people can do, or do you want me to do a little commentary or anything?
Yeah, I want to make room for your commentary.
Oh, well, thank you.
I want to bring you into the room. I don't want to make you feel helpless.
Yeah, we were just lined up for the same joke. I hope the floor in this room is not electrified. So I think that all of my responses would flow naturally into like, what can people do about this? The big takeaway from this is the obvious Rick Hansen point, which you've made 700 million times through your long career, because you're extremely old, as we've talked about, which is that, you have to really do this over and over and over and over again. And it's going to feel like Sisyphus pushing the rock up the hill. It's going to feel every single time like what you're doing is impossible and like it's only going to end in failure. And every time that you experience any kind of negative blowback from what you're doing, that is going to want to convince you that there is no point and you should just get off the ride. And this is a big problem for people because negative feedback is an inevitable part of life, no matter what we're doing. And I was talking with Kimberly Quinlan recently. She's an anxiety and OCD specialist. And I asked her a question that we get a lot, which is sort of implicit in this question in a way, which is, what do you do when the exposure doesn't go well? What do you do when you're somebody who's got a little social anxiety and you try to be a little bigger in a group and you just feel like the group doesn't respond very positively to you? Like, wow, for somebody who has that learned helplessness framework, that would really naturally reinforce that feeling in this very, very strong way. And her response to it, I thought, was really wonderful, which is that there's this kind of mindset shift that happens over time as you do this sort of work, where it's not about not experiencing any anxiety or not experiencing any helplessness or, whatever we're doing here. It's about understanding that that's part of the game. And what she is always really excited to hear from the people that she works with is not, I went a week and I didn't experience any anxiety. It's, I went a week and I experienced a ton of anxiety and I kept on going anyways. And that's what she thinks is really helps people kind of work through that feeling. And it really dovetails with what you're talking about here, Dad. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really great. I want to suggest 3 things right off the top.
Yeah.
See
great.
what you think about them. First is to track the freeze response as a bodily state. That is very somatic and very much involving with the autonomic nervous system. People talk about shutdown in polyvagal theory, or the polyvagal framework developed by Steve Porges and others. People talk about excessive activation of the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. This is the most ancient, speaking of, original branch of the nervous system, which helps us to rest and digest. That's good, but in the extreme, it becomes a kind of playing dead, which animals do to escape threats, and is a kind of freeze response. So it's very embodied. It's very bodily. Tune into the bodily aspects of this. Become aware of it. Know what it feels like. the sleepiness, the sense of de-energization, the slumping of mood that's associated with this, a feeling of dread even that just is inchoate, doesn't have a clear explanation. It's just all pervading. Know what that's like. By knowing what it's like, you'll get some breathing room from it. And over time, you'll be able to master it, over time. A second suggestion related to this is to, as much as you can, look for opportunities to experience vitality. That's the opposite of the freeze state. Vitality for any reason, playing tennis or teasing your father or anything you want to do that gives you a sense of aliveness, largeness. The freeze response is about being small. It's often very associated with the shame response, which also is a kind of freezing as we knuckle under and we go small, often to propitiate aggression around us, like the alphas in our school or home, or 20 million years ago in our baboon troop. The movement against that is to be large, is to be big, to lift your chest, to wave your arms, which is what I'm doing right now, to create a sense of vitality. That's really important. And then the third suggestion I would have.
Can I jump in here for 1 second, Dad? Okay. As somebody starts to do that, and I have a little bit of personal experience with this, not because I was like a big freeze response guy, but because for me, various versions of, I don't know if this is relevant or not, but like the really quick version, as we've talked about a lot on the podcast, I got a lot of negative feedback from kids growing up about being big, exuberant.
I want to track them all down and tell them how wrong they were.
We're not going Taken style on this one, Dad.
Oldguyspayback.com.
Yeah, exactly.
Hashtag.
Exactly. I have a hard time seeing you in the Liam Neeson role, but I appreciate your overall vibe here, Pops. That's not really your overall style.
Movie,
okay, anyways, as you go through that process of being bigger, if that's something that's not comfortable for you for whatever reason, you're pushing an edge. It is really, really normal for that to feel A, incredibly dumb, and B, to activate some pretty complicated emotions that a person might be feeling inside of them. Some shame, some disgust, weird feelings about their body, all of that kind of stuff. Sure. A great way to practice this is on your own. On your own, in front of a mirror. Be big in a safe space first. Be loud in a safe space first. Do it in the environment that's going to support you being able to do that. It's going to be hard enough to do it just on your own.
Great
and
advice.
A lot of time what happens is that people put themselves in a position to fail by just dive bombing into the deep end of the pool without really learning how to swim first. So put on your floaties, do it in an environment that is conducive to being successful here. Anyways, go ahead, Dad.
Oh, fantastic advice for us. I'm really glad you said that. And set yourself up to win. Yeah. And also, if you are in situations where the people around you they don't want you to be big and they will hurt you if you take up space, obviously be very careful about that. All right. So third suggestion, know what agency feels like in easy ways. There you are having a meal. Do you want the salt? Do you want more salt? Decide to reach for the salt. Know what it's like to see the salt. I want the salt. I'm going to get the salt. Reach for the salt. Get the salt. Congratulate yourself for getting the salt. Know what that feels like. It's silly. It's small. It's simple. But that's a building block that can gradually, over time, develop a much greater sense of potency, that you're a cue ball, not the 8 ball, as you go through life. And then you can expand those examples of agency and efficacy into bigger and bigger things and take in the results along the way, the sense of yourself as someone who is a cause in life, not just an effect.
I think that's a great answer, Dad. And so for our next question, which I think has some similarities to that one and also to the first one that we answered. My childhood was unstable due to my parents' alcoholism, domestic violence, and constant relocations. I'm now in my late 30s, and I'm still living with family, despite having good grades, a few career successes, and, at least I think, reasonably good social skills. I just can't seem to make the jump into true adulthood. My only attempt to move out in my early 30s lasted less than a week, intensifying my shame. I look functional from the outside and hide the struggle from most people. What steps would you recommend for somebody in my situation to finally transition to independent living? What might be keeping me stuck despite my outward signs of capability? Really interesting question, I thought.
It's a haunting question. And
Yeah. In the experience of many, many people these days.
I find myself wondering about the word family. They're living with family. Are they living with either or both of their parents, or maybe with a sibling, perhaps a relative? If they're living with one of or either of their parents, given the history, that would really stand out for me as, what's going on with that? To go the other way, maybe things have gotten better. The parents sometimes wise up over time. Sometimes drug and alcohol issues reduce sometimes as people get older. Then I also find myself wondering about, this doesn't sound like a person has a job. They seem financially dependent. Doesn't sound like they're dating.
The job part I'm not clear on, just as a in terms of the context of the question. They talk about having some career successes and this not being so obvious from the outside. It's possible that this person is
maybe
doing
working.
Okay.
Yeah. So I wonder about all that. All that said, then we start thinking about small steps and building more of a life that's independent, that's individuated, right? What might that be? And I would be interested in, what gives you passion? What do you really like doing that's your own? What's your own, right? Maybe develop some things that are really your own. Doesn't have to be a new job or, a romantic relationship. Could be something like you get really interested in, I don't know, playing poker socially, right? Or swing dancing, or, some political cause, volunteering, your church, your synagogue, your temple, things like that. What's actually your own? Maybe a serious hobby. Get really good at coin collecting or macrame. Something, that's your own. I'll just pause there while I keep thinking more about this. How would you reply to this person?
I think this is a great point that you're making here, Dad, because what's sort of inside of it is, how do you do a good exposure for this kind of a problem?
Yeah, step by step.
Step by step. How do you create a graded approach where you can get the experience of something going well inside of this? Because what really stands out to me in the question is that they tried and it didn't go well. So they had that experience that I was kind of talking about last time. Like, what do you do when it doesn't go well? Because that just really reinforces all of the narrative that you've created about yourself. I am the kind of person who cannot accomplish this. I am the kind of person who fails when I try to do this thing. And so that's the belief system that I think that any good solution would attack. And I'm not sure how to do a good exposure for this problem was one of the reasons that I found the question really interesting. I would wonder about some version of moving into a different living environment where you still had a degree of social support. So I'm wondering if there's a friend system that's going on. Would it be possible to live with other people as opposed to just living by yourself, which could be a really large step for this person? Is there extended family that would be more kind of palatable to you, that would make you feel more like a adult who is on your own, who is doing your own thing? Is there something that you could do in your work life or your hobby life that would make you feel more successful, or a goal you could set for yourself that would make you feel a little bit more independent? Could you try something on in kind of an unrelated area? Maybe this is not somebody, this is just an easy example. I use it all the time, and this may or may not be for this person, but maybe you're not an exerciser, but you decide, okay, I'm going to develop some kind of an exercise habit, both because moving is good and it makes you feel a little bit more motive in your life in general, but also as a way to demonstrate to yourself that you can do things that are outside of your comfort zone. So I would look for kind of other stuff that's on the edges of the comfort zone and see if you could develop an interest or a proficiency with it that would then kind of convince you that you're the kind of person who can do hard things. And maybe that would be a way to kind of backdoor this problem a little bit.
I love all that. I'm imagining myself into the mind, the being of this person. And intuitively, what comes forward is first fear. They're scared. And we're scared to leave the nest, understandably. It's scary out there. So how do we what do we need inside ourselves when we're scared to leave the the burrow, the den, right? The cave, the nest. What do we need? We need two things in particular. We need the support of others who will be with us as we step out into the world, emotionally, certainly, and even potentially physically. They will be with us as we move out into the world. And we need a sense of a good world to move out into. What's the compelling vision that you have passion for and you care about for the life you'd like to have, no longer living with family? And really develop that. I'm not hearing the development of that vision. I'm hearing it as more like abstract, as kind of a should related to where you are in the developmental trajectory, maybe with some guilt around it and some self-criticism around it, rather than what do you like? What is it that you really, really like that you're trying to move toward? So I would highlight those two things in a context of compassion for oneself. Like, yeah, this is scary. Back to the freeze person. It's really important to bring compassion both to the B group dogs and to the experimenters who kind of had to drag the dogs through all that, but especially, of course, for the dogs, compassion for them and compassion for others and oneself who have been traumatized and developed learned helplessness and the freeze response in general. That's also a really important thing. I want a name for that one. But for this person, yeah, it's scary to leave the nest. And so how can you help yourself? How can you empower yourself with companions who are going with you toward a brighter future?
I think that's a great answer, Dad. So we have at least one more question. We'll see how much time this one takes us. My daughter was recently diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and is now receiving treatment from a therapist. That therapist has mentioned that she could also be bipolar. I've read that these two conditions are often misdiagnosed for one another. As a worried mom, this is concerning for me because I've read that some treatments like SSRIs might work for one of these conditions, but be less effective for another. Could you shine some light on these diagnoses and possible treatments? What do you think, Dad?
It's a deep question. There are so-called comorbid conditions. Sometimes people have two things. Let's also be really clear that psychiatric diagnoses are not like diagnosing someone with, let's say, a broken leg or a staph infection in their throat. These are fuzzy, and sometimes people don't exactly fit, one diagnosis or another. So the point of diagnoses is that, are they useful for us? That said, really briefly, it's definitely true that what characterizes a borderline personality type is instability of identity, instability of relationships, instability of emotional regulation, definitely instability of sense of self, instability of life behavior. Okay, so there's an attempt, to help them create more stability, both from the outside in and from the inside out. Great. Bipolar involves true manic episodes. Now, what is it, bipolar 2 or something? That's more
Yes,
hypomanic.
yeah.
Hypomanic to me is kind
More
of a
mild
fuzzy
mania,
term. Where does adolescent excitement and intensity end, and where
Yeah.
does hypomania
And the hypomania
begin?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. I think about, I don't know what, conductors of a symphony who are really just carried away by the music. Are they being hypomanic, during Beethoven's Ninth? Let's
Sure.
say.
Yeah, I think that, one of the ways that people talk about this is it environment appropriate? Is one
Yeah.
of the big qualifiers for this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Like, does it make
Yeah.
sense based on the other stuff that's going on? Just as a quick bit of information about this for people, a truly manic episode, you're not functional. You are not able to
Yep.
exist in a society, as we like to say, in the manner that a person would prefer to.
Yeah.
So hypomania is kind of a version of that, but it's much more functional, much more mild. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's actually worth people tracking in themselves, whether they move into kind of a hypomanic state in which maybe they're particularly a little grandiose,
Yeah.
a little
Revved up.
insistent, a little irritable in ways that are interpersonally problematic, maybe a little inflated in who they are, maybe less impulse control. There's a place for kind of noticing that, and it's nice to have a little label for it. But my favorite example of a manic episode without psychotic features, I've known manic episodes with psychotic features, but without, somebody basically contacted me and said, I think it was through my dad, he has bipolar. And I asked him, how do you know he has bipolar? And he said, well, recently in an episode, he walked into a Trader Joe's grocery store and he thought, oh, I better get some cheese. And he ended up, putting it in modern terms, walking out with about $2,000 worth of cheese. He just bought all the cheese in the store. Okay, that's a little bit of a manic episode of a certain kind. Okay. So then the question becomes, is this, quote unquote, just emotional instability, labile, affect, maybe to an extreme in a particularly borderline-ish kind of person? Or is this a true manic episode, which is characterized by things like pressured speech, flights of fancy, extreme grandiosity, extreme and often self-destructive impulsivity, great irritability when, if at all, thwarted or resisted in any way? That extreme quality, is that actually present when this borderline person, is being emotional, let's say? And then is it followed by a crashing depression? Because it's bipolar, it's depression, real depression, not just, oh, I was such a fool, I feel terrible, but I mean clinical depression. So that's a bit of the differential. With regard to the medication, I'm not a psychiatrist. I know a lot about, neurochemistry and so forth, but I don't give professional opinions about medication. And I think that's definitely, worth tracking and being really careful about. And meanwhile, there's a lot to do that's not medication centered for either condition. And definitely if it's a dual diagnosis, there's plenty you can do from the mental health standpoint, the social support standpoint. Mindfulness-based interventions have a lot of, I think, benefit for borderline conditions, certainly, things of that sort.
So in terms of talking a little bit more about treatments, I looked into the pharmacology of it because I was just curious about it. I'm extremely not a doctor. It turns out that SSRIs are actually sometimes prescribed for both of them, but they're not considered a frontline treatment for bipolar. Yeah. I believe that the concern about that is because they are a serotonin reuptake inhibitor. Hello, that creates more serotonin, and the concern is that that could lead to a manic episode for somebody. Yeah. So that's why they're not always sort of a frontline treatment. But of course, we can't speak to this particular person, and those conversations just need to happen with a doctor. In terms of the more mental healthy stuff, DBT is an approach to therapy that was created specifically for working with borderline personality. It's a really interesting approach. It has a lot of qualities that are very similar to aspects from ACT or aspects from other mindfulness-based approaches to therapy, where you're really trying to increase psychological flexibility by being able to essentially hold different things as being true in your mind at the same time. So what you see a lot in borderline in particular is what's called splitting or black and white thinking, where things are made either all good or all bad. And we want to have more flexibility inside of ourselves. And there's kind of this very rapid movement often from viewing other people as being either all good or all bad. And that's what is a feature of that kind of underlying instability. So we want to kind of help people build up the sense that, hey, you can be both good and have positive qualities and negative qualities at the same time. And just the fact that they have negative qualities doesn't make them all bad. And the fact that they have positive qualities doesn't make them all good. So these are just different approaches that people use to these.
That's great. I just had a couple final thoughts, just feeling my way into this parent and also this kid, and it sounds like a young adult, maybe a teenager. One is